Right now, we're in a time and a place where we want more stories of resistance and resilience. That's one of the things that I'm excited about participating in this workshop and also in this podcast is about inspiring others and bringing more Jewish voices to the fore that can tell these stories that are stories of Jewish life, not Jewish death, that are stories of resistance and resilience.
This is the Book of Life. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. You know Highlights, the kids' magazine full of stories and hidden picture brain teasers? Well, Highlights also has a foundation that runs workshops to help authors and illustrators hone their craft. On March 15th through 18th, 2019, novelists and publishing professionals will gather in Honesdale, Pennsylvania for a symposium on Jewish children's literature run by the Highlights Foundation. Today, you'll hear from some of the faculty of that workshop: Adam Gidwitz, Catherine Locke, Susan Kussell, and Rena Rossner. After you hear from them, you'll probably want to sign up for their workshop. Don't worry, all the information is linked at bookoflifepodcast.com. And that's also where you can leave a comment to join the conversation about Jewish children's books beyond the Holocaust and holidays. Susan Kussell, Adam Gidwitz, Catherine Locke, you've all been on the Book of Life podcast before, so it's nice to have you back. And Rena Rossner, welcome. I'm glad to have you here as well. I was pleased to see so many people that I am a fan of on the staff of the Highlights Foundation workshop. Now, you will all be on the staff of this writing workshop at Highlights called Beyond the Holocaust and Holidays, for authors who want to create Jewish fiction for kids. The authors will be your students. I was intrigued by some of the questions that are going to be discussed in the description of the workshop, and I was jealous that I couldn't be there, so I have called you all together today to do a sort of mini version of the workshop and just broadly discuss those questions. The first question is based on the title of the workshop. The workshop is called Beyond the Holocaust and Holidays. So, what kinds of stories are Jewish stories besides Holocaust and holiday stories? Let's start with Rena's take.
I'm a literary agent that lives and works in Jerusalem, but also has many clients who are not Israeli, who are American. And obviously, by my accent, you can tell I'm originally American. A lot of Israeli authors tend to not necessarily write about the holidays because they're national holidays. They're a part of daily life. They're just there. It's not something that defines their Judaism, so they seek other things to write about. A great example is one of my authors set her story in Babylon with these ancient demons from the Talmud and from different Midrashim, Jewish myths and legends. And that kind of defined her Judaism. I heard about a great new book that's coming out next year called The Golem of Souls. The author is from South Korea. They bring Earth from South Korea to America and create a golem. Those are the amazing ways that I want to see Judaism reflected in its multiplicity, in the different cultures that it comes from, and in so many different ways that go way beyond the holidays and the ways we normally see ourselves depicted in fiction. One of my clients' books called Anya and the Dragon is coming out next year. It's about a little girl in 9th, 10th century Russia. And there aren't tremendous signifiers that makes her family Jewish, but baking challah with her grandmother is one of them. And there's a scroll that they read from, which is sort of like the Torah, but it doesn't hit you over the head with its Judaism.
I have to jump in and just say that Anya and the Dragon is a wonderful book, and I'm very excited for it to come out. I hope everybody reads it. It's both Jewish and just excellent through and through. Sorry to interrupt, Rena.
Thank you. Right. So that's an example of the wonderful story about a girl trying to choose between saving her home and her town or this dragon she discovers. And the Judaism is just sort of there. And I know we said not to talk about holidays, but, you know, another one of my authors, for example, Leah Shire's Your Voice Is All I Hear, there's nothing terribly Jewish about anybody in the book, except that when they go shopping for presents around holiday time, they go Hanukkah shopping and not Christmas shopping. That's maybe a page in the book. Otherwise, you wouldn't necessarily know that they're Jewish. So I think Judaism can operate on so many levels we talk about it as a religion, we talk about it as a culture, we talk about it as something that's in the blood, right? There's so many different ways to be Jewish, and that's going to look different for every creator.
For me, signifiers of a book being Jewish, as someone who didn't grow up particularly religious and whose parents are no longer members of a congregation and don't feel religious, and I'm a patrilineal Jew, for me, growing up, a kid with the last name Epstein in a book was Jewish, and I saw myself. It didn't matter if that was the only part of the book that was Jewish. That felt Jewish. I don't have a particularly Jewish last name, and that was still enough for me. The page about shopping for Hanukkah, I think that would have been like one of those, oh, they're like me moments when I was a reader. So when I think about books and whether or not they're Jewish, I try to think about it as, would this book be Jewish enough for me as a reader? And I feel like I am pickier about that as an adult than I was as a kid. And maybe that's because we just have more books now. But the bar's pretty low for me. If I feel like it's a positive portrayal of a Jewish person, the lack of a conflict or a plot or a setting that revolves around Judaism doesn't bother me.
All right, Katie, thank you. Is there a difference between writing for Jewish children or about Jewish children? Do you write differently if you think that the audience is going to be a Jewish or non-Jewish reader? Do non-Jewish readers have different needs than Jewish readers? What do you think?
I'm always picturing a class or even a gymnasium full of children who could potentially be reading my books. And I'm thinking about keeping all of the kids entertained as I write the books. I often write my books out loud and try to picture the children's reaction. Love the moments when a Jewish kid really excited internally, the way that Katie was just describing as when she was little and hearing the name Epstein or shopping for Hanukkah. But I also want to make sure that I'm not leaving the non-Jewish kids behind. They may not have the same feelings at those specific moments. That's fine. But I don't want them to feel totally lost. So, no, I write the same because I figure that a Jew and a non-Jew, a boy and a girl, a child and an adult is reading the book at the same time, and I want them all to connect to the extent that they can.
Susan.
I have my debut picture book coming out in 2020, and it's been really fascinating to see the different reactions that Jewish people have told certain characters in the book, and they know things, and they know certain Jewish conventions, and the people that aren't Jewish are confused and what's happening here. And so it's been very interesting to see things that I have completely taken for granted that I didn't even realize I had to explain. And I don't want kids to be confused, but at the same time, I also don't want the Jewish kids to feel that they're being over explained or lectured to. So it is a fine line.
Katie, what do you think?
I hope that all of our books, since we're all authors here, humanize Jewish people to non-Jewish readers who may not have regular interactions with us. I hope that from our books, non-Jewish readers understand that Jewish people are more than people who survived the Holocaust and people who did not survive the Holocaust. I hope that they are introduced to our myths and our stories and our magic and our nonviolent history as much as they're exposed to terrible things that have also happened. So for me, it's very important that I reach non-Jewish readers as well. I feel like that is part of my mission as an author. It's just walking that line of explaining and not explaining. That's the hardest part.
Good. So let's talk about the concept of own voices. #own voices. Before we delve into it, does anybody want to take a stab at defining the concept of own voices?
I can try. Own voices is a concept that was first coined by Corinne Duvis, who is a YA author in the Netherlands. And the idea behind own voices originally was that it was a way of marking a story online through a hashtag, meaning that a main character or main part of the book shared something with the author. An own voices Jewish book would be a book with a Jewish main character, a Jewish concept or feel to it that was written by a Jewish author. It's morphed and it's changed, and there's a lot of controversy and debate around it. But that was the original idea, is that it was a way of marking that a story was written by somebody who had a personal experience with it and that there was a level of authenticity to the story because the author shared a main trait with the story.
So I want to ask how you feel about own voices, if you feel that it is important in kidlit in general or in Jewish literature in particular, whether it's a positive thing, whether there's any downside to own voices authorship. Katie, let's go with you to begin with.
I think that there's a pretty big difference when you look at a Holocaust story told by a non-Jewish person and a Holocaust story told by a Jewish person. So that's one area where I think that own voices is really important. I think it's a good way to signify that some of us are Jewish who have names like Catherine Locke, which is not a particularly Jewish name. But I have mixed feelings on it, and I think that it can be used to police people in ways that are very uncomfortable.
Rena, what do you want to add?
I think that what you feel comfortable telling and what you don't feel comfortable telling is going to be different for every person. Is being Jewish enough to tell any Jewish story? I won't tell Ethiopian people's stories. So there's a lot of nuance to it, and I think part of it is personal comfort level.
Adam, let's hear from you now.
My experience specifically with it has been particularly entwined with the Unicorn Rescue Society. When I first started planning and writing the series, We Need Diverse Books had burst onto the scene and was very influential. But I hadn't heard about Own Voices yet, just We Need Diverse Books. And so Unicorn Rescue Society has two main characters, Elliot Eisner, who is Jewish, and Uchenna Devereaux, who is black and based on a former student of mine who I asked if I could base the book on her, and she read it, and she was a big fan of her character and her depiction. And that does introduce a black female main character who I hope and believe a lot of black girls have identified with. In fact, there's one particular group of white boys who also really identify with her. There's a group of kids out in rural New Jersey who play the Uchenna game apparently every day, where they each take turns getting to be Uchenna, and the rest have to be the other characters from the book, which makes me very happy. But the series, each book, they go to a different place. They learn about the culture, the mythology, and they help local people rescue a mythical creature. I was at a writer's conference, and Own Voices as an idea was introduced to me for the first time. And I thought, wow, yeah, that's so much better than what I'm currently doing. I shouldn't be writing these books where they go to different places and learn about the cultures, at least not alone. I should be writing them with people from those cultures. How much richer will those books be? So the third book in the Unicorn Rescue Society takes place on a Native American tribal lands and is co-written by Joseph Bruchac, a Native American author. Book 4 takes place in the border between Mexico and Texas, co-written by David Bowles, a Mexican-American author from that region. And the next two books, Emma Otegi and Hannah Khan, are writing with me. And in those cases, my job is to keep the Unicorn Rescue Society sounding like the Unicorn Rescue Society. And our job together is to create a really rich depiction of that world and how these main characters interact with that world. I just think that it's better for the books. I think it's better for the readers because we are bringing more voices that various readers can identify with. It makes the experience a richer experience. That doesn't mean that every book has to be co-written with, 8 authors to cover every character in your book. We're always imagining and putting ourselves in other people's voices and other people's bodies and other people's lives as authors. But it does mean that if the primary theme of the book is the experience of somebody who is not you, then asking yourself, could this book be better? And why am I the person to write it? Why do I get the royalties from telling this story? When Katie mentioned the Holocaust stories, I think about that all the time. Why is that person making money off of a story that isn't theirs?
Can I jump in real quick? Own Voices, to me, is writing stories inside your lane with characters inside your lane. And if you're a non-Jewish author, instead of writing a book about the Holocaust, signal boosting, buying, promoting, sharing, encouraging your libraries to buy books about the Holocaust written by Jewish authors, that's a way to support Own Voices without taking space.
So the Sidney Taylor Book Award does not require that the authors be Jewish. And we've had some excellent books that have won the award by non-Jewish authors. For instance, Marcus Zusak, who won for The Book Thief or The Hired Girl by Laura Amy Schlitz. My Grandfather's Coat by Jim Aylesworth and illustrated by Barbara McClintock. So we've had a number of non-Jewish people create excellent Jewish books. So it's not their own voice, but they have done their homework. And so the books are authentic in their Jewishness. So what does that reality mean in relationship to this whole own voices movement? Does it take some of the steam out of the push for own voices, or is it an exception that proves the rule, or what do you think?
We do accept books by non-Jewish authors. I have to be honest, I don't investigate every book. Is this a Jewish author? Is that not a Jewish author? They're all eligible, as long as they have authentic Jewish content. I think that own voices are very important, and all those books you mentioned are also great, wonderful books. It is kind of a difficult thing to navigate, isn't it?
There are two ways of approaching the question of own voices. One is from the author's perspective, and one is from the reader's perspective. And then from the readers, it's also bifurcated between readers who are represented in that story and readers who are looking at that story from the outside. So as an author, when I'm deciding what project to take on, now that I am aware of own voices and aware of the importance of it, and the fact that I wasn't before is my own ignorance, my own blindness. But now that I am aware of it, I choose very carefully who I want to write about and what stories I want to write, as I think all the authors on this podcast have been saying. When I read a story, I am also very sensitive, and sometimes a goy does it really, really well. I think that most people felt like the depiction of the Jewish home in Hired Girl by Laura Amy Schlitz was wonderful. You know, I've known Laura since I was a child. She taught at a school that is mostly Jewish. I don't know if that has anything to do with it, the school I went to. I read that book, and I felt at home in a Jewish home in 1911 Baltimore. As a Jewish reader reading a book about Jews by a non-Jew, I feel fairly qualified to talk about whether it worked or not.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and say that recently I was speaking to a crowd of people about my book, and somebody said to me that one of the best parts that she saw in my book that she hadn't seen in other books that set themselves in Eastern Europe, whether they were written by Jews or non-Jews, was that I depicted life in the shtetl as the Jews and non-Jews' lives being very much intermingled. This person was a historian, and they were saying that they very much appreciated that because most people think that it was only Jews who lived in the shtetl.
That shtetl thing you're talking about, Rena, is really the Fiddler on the Roof effect.
Yes, I agree. And that's what most people associate with a shtetl, right? And that was never the case, or almost never. There were always Jews living alongside non-Jews, and how much she appreciated that I'd done that in my novel. Now, I didn't know that I'd done that in my novel. I only know that I did a tremendous amount of research and used a tremendous amount of source material to try to recreate the shtetl of Dubicery that my family came from. So I think it is possible to do your research and do it well, whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish. And sometimes you don't even know how well you researched your book. But at the same time, as a reader, my ears are always attuned to mistakes. For example, when they were doing my audiobook, I demanded that I be allowed to listen to it before they went on air with it, because there was not going to be a Jewish word mispronounced on my watch. And I went through 20 hours of my audiobook and made sure that everything was pronounced correctly. And having said all of that, someone told me that all my Yiddish pronunciations were actually not Ukrainian and Moldavian, but were actually Romanian, which goes along with the fact that my grandmother's Romanian. So you could never get it perfect, even if you try.
That's really funny because long after I last saw my book, a Yiddish word was changed to the German word. And I found it when I got my finished copies. And it was very upsetting. No one else has noticed it, but I certainly did. But something about the Own Voices is that I also trust an Own Voices author a little more. I just read Spitting Silver in August, and it was beautiful. But I have to admit, like when I picked it up and it starts with a Jewish moneylender, I was holding my breath. But it was because I knew the author was Jewish that I kept reading, that I even picked it up to begin with, knowing that premise. There is an aspect to Own Voices that builds a bridge and allows me to have that trust that something like that is going to be handled well.
It's interesting, Catherine, that you mentioned Spitting Silver, because I was recently reading a review that criticized that book because there was no Yiddish in it. And I was really upset by that because I was like, one of the things that fantasy enables you to do is it enables you to imagine alternate pasts, presents, and futures. And if a Jewish author wants to imagine in Eastern Europe where there was no Yiddish, they have every right to do that. And if an author wants to imagine a future where Yiddish is a language that we all speak, we have a right to do that. So to a certain degree, do you have a right to imagine a shtetl that's only full of Jews? Sure. But there's also the place of historical accuracy, and it depends on what you're claiming your book is. Could I have done whatever I wanted in my fantasy novel? Sure, I guess I could have. But to me, I tried to create the authenticity there. But I think that that's what happens when you have an own voice as author. You're along for the ride and you're saying, I trust that what you're doing, whatever it might be, is a version of the truth you want to tell.
I love that. I really love that.
In terms of something that you would like to invite listeners to do to help heal the world, what would you say about your thoughts on Tikkun Olam?
For many years, I have had a commitment to being a mentor. What I would encourage people to do is to just take time to listen to the people in your life, to reach out and just checking in with them, seeing how they're doing. If they're in your field, saying, hey, I see you're at the beginning of your career. Where are you trying to go in that? What can I do? What would you like to know? How can I help you? I had people help me out, and this is my way of paying it forward. And it's been one of the most rewarding things in my life. So I would recommend giving it a try.
I was at a wedding the day after the shooting that happened in Pittsburgh. During the wedding, there were police all around the synagogue. And when I left the wedding, there were 3 police cars outside, and I felt safe. And the next day I went on Twitter and said, it was really hard. I was at a wedding under the chuppah. A female Orthodox rabbi, a Maharat, brought up the idea that when we break the glass under the chuppah, we're going to also think about the people who were murdered yesterday. And, everybody was crying. And that I walked out of the synagogue and I felt safe because there were police there. And then somebody on Twitter was talking about how they were Black and Jewish and how having police outside a synagogue does not make them feel safe. And I had to stop in my tracks and say, oh, wow, that's my privilege speaking. I don't think that there's an answer to this yet, because not having our synagogues protected isn't the answer either, right? So I think the most important thing that all of us can do, whether you have a place of worship or not, maybe it's your office, maybe it's a school, wherever it is that you encounter other people, is to try to be more inclusive and to try to reach out to somebody who doesn't look like you, to try to reach out to somebody who you've never spoken to before, who you wouldn't normally speak to. Greet them at the entrance to the synagogue, or make sure they have a place to sit, or just even engage them in conversation to try to make all of our places more inclusive.
Catherine. One of the things that's really stuck with me over the last couple of years is a sign I saw at the Women's March in January of 2017, which said courage over comfort. And I have tried to take that as my watchword. For me, that means that I am reading and watching media outside of my comfort zone. So whether that means reading a book like Tomorrow Will Be Different, or So You Want to Talk About Race, or listening to a podcast like She's All Fat, whatever is uncomfortable for you, go learn about it, read about it, listen to people who are living that experience. It may or may not change your worldview, but you won't be a worse person for having learned more. As a diehard Ravenclaw, my method is always to learn more. I feel like that's how I cope with everything, but moving outside of my comfort zone with what I've been consuming in terms of media has helped me be a better person in the world, and I think it would help a lot of people be a better person in the world.
I think, especially in the context of this Jewish podcast, I've been thinking a lot about my history, my family's history in this country. I think every immigrant family has a story like this. My Papa Jake, my great-grandfather, was the first person on that side of the family to come to this country, and he was a pots and pans peddler, and we've always told a story about him working his way up, selling pots and pans, and buying a hardware store, and then opening a second hardware store, and then giving his 3 sons enough money to buy a small hand cream company, which became a shampoo company, and that our family was established in this country through the hard work of Papa Jake, all of which is true. But I recently read his own account of that history, and what it leaves out is that his hardware store was selling on credit to black sharecroppers, and that there was one plot of land where, through some legal wrangling that I don't quite understand, he evicted 26 of the 30 families who lived on that land. He used the money he got from that land to buy some more land, and he became one of the largest landowners in his little corner of a county in Mississippi. We all have mythology that we tell about our families and also about ourselves. And I think often that mythology glazes over our role, our complicity, and how we profit from a system in this country that was designed to be racist, that was built explicitly by the founders to count black slaves as 3/5 of people, that was built long before that to eradicate, to murder Native Americans, and then to make them invisible, to ensure that every person of darkish complexion that came to these shores worked for white people. We live in a white supremacist country, and all of us who can pass for white, even if we are Jewish, even if my great-grandfather, Papa Jake, was absolutely persecuted for being Jewish, and yet when he punched out his persecutor in small town in Mississippi where he lived, the persecutor's brothers refused to support bringing charges. Had my great-grandfather been black, he would have been hanged for sure. He would have been lynched. So I have profited from a white supremacist system, and I still do. And so the way that I am working these days on Tikkun Olam, on making the world whole, is just by talking about it, is by trying to point out that I live and profit from a white supremacist and a patriarchal, male-dominated system. I profit from it every single day. And I want to tear it down, and I want to help the people who have been working to tear it down a lot longer than I've even been aware of the problem. And so I would ask the listeners to think about, even if it's hard for you to admit personal complicity, at least perhaps familial or systemic or societal complicity, and to think about the ways you can raise your voice, you can talk, and you can use honesty and kindness to tear down systems of racism, of white supremacy, and of patriarchy.
That was amazing. Thank you.
That was basically the microphone drop moment.
It really was. Can we just say ditto?
Is there anything that anybody would like to talk about that I haven't thought to ask you?
Somebody was talking about my book and felt that there wasn't enough blood and guts and gore in the book because it's a book about the pogroms, and that I didn't really properly show how horrible the time was then. I was very upset by that because I was like, no, we're allowed to write Jewish stories that aren't about Jewish pain, right? We're allowed to tell Jewish stories that are about Jewish life, not Jewish death. I don't know how to phrase the question, but that's something I'd like to touch upon. And I feel like Katie would have something to say too about it.
I always have something to say on this. I felt that criticism also with my books. I have a trade review that doesn't think The Spy with the Red Balloon touched enough on the Holocaust. Like it was my obligation to write about the Holocaust as a Jewish author writing about World War II, when I very specifically limited what I touched on in that book because I didn't want it to be a Holocaust book. I think people have a really specific idea of what Jewish joy looks like, and it's holiday joy. So I really want to see more Jewish books that show Jewish joy outside of holidays. And also throughout history, Jewish people have been victims of horrible things throughout history around the world. But we've also been part of really amazing things, like historical achievements and discoveries and explorations and communities. And I want to see more of that. And I really don't think that we should be policing each other or others should be policing us about how we depict either joy or pain. I feel like we're seeing some really great Jewish children's literature that is breaking out of that mold. But some of this starts at a publisher and some of this starts at the consumer. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where the stories that are bought are the Holocaust stories. So then the stories that are acquired are Holocaust stories. And that kind of gets spun together. That's why I'm really excited for your book. And I hope it gets really widely read because it's a different way of looking at that history.
I think that definitely right now we're in a time and a place where we want more stories of resistance and resilience. That's one of the things that I'm excited about participating in this workshop and also in this podcast is about inspiring others and bringing more Jewish voices to the fore that can tell these stories that are stories of Jewish life, not Jewish death, that are stories of resistance and resilience that signify that so much a part of who we are as a people. And we don't get to see that enough in the pages of books.
We can end right there. That's the perfect ending note.
Okay.
Susan, Adam, Catherine, Rena, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Heidi. This has been great.
I just wanted to say thank you for a great conversation, thoughtful and difficult in just the best possible ways. So Heidi, thanks for hosting us, and everybody, thanks for your wisdom and insight.
This is Susan Kussell. You just heard me talking about the Highlights Foundation workshop, but guess what? I'm also the chair of the Sidney Taylor Book Award Committee, and I'll be back in the next episode to tell you all about the 2019 winners. And I'd like to dedicate that episode to the entire Sidney Taylor Book Award Committee, who has worked so hard, and also to the wonderful Association of Jewish Libraries.
If you enjoy the Book of Life podcast, please become a patron at patreon.com/bookoflife. Leave a review on iTunes or a comment on our blog at bookoflifepodcast.com. You can also like our page at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening and happy reading.